Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Elliott Masie. I will tell you all about Elliott in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff. You know, the caring, the commitment, the compassion we exert for others. And when you do it as a leader, and you will discover certainly that Elliott is, you do it to bring people together, energize them for a better purpose. Welcome, Elliott Masie.
Well, welcome, John. It's an honor to share with you digitally live and in the cloud.
Great. Well, you know I'm a big fan of you, but I want to tell folks a little bit about you, and then we'll get into our conversation. Elliott is provocative, engaging, and entertaining, and he's a great storyteller. He's an educator. He has been called the father of e-learning, which goes way, way back to the 90s, way in the 90s. So he formed the Learning Collaborative, which is a coalition of 75 global organizations with companies that you might have heard of: Amazon, Zoom, Bank of America, Subway, the Hartford, you name it. He's the editor of eNotes and Trends, and he's received all kinds of awards. He also does something extraordinary, and particularly, and he is a Broadway producer, which we will explore, because I think that's really cool. And he has been staging a series of empathy concerts that we will talk about momentarily. Elliott, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Well, thank you. And it's just a delightful way for me to spend part of Thursday with you and your listeners and viewers.
Well, thank you. We're in a virtual world now more than we really wanted to be, but you've been exploring this world for a long, long time. So what does it mean? What is e-learning and where is it going?
Well, you know, e-learning was a term that popped up in the 1990s. There was an interesting moment when we put the word E in front of a lot of things. For people who are old enough, remember there was email. We still use that. You didn't order online or from Amazon. You did, e-commerce, e-business. And people decided, well, maybe we'll see what we could do to marry emerging technology, which is the very beginning of the internet, with learning and education. And I was one of a couple people who started to think about how that would look. And we decided to call it E. But to be honest, John, the E then stood for electronic. I mean, if it would dealt with electronics, it was an E. Because I'm a kind of out-of-the-box guy, as you know, I had other meanings for E. Engaging, maybe sometimes entertaining. Wouldn't it be wonderful if it went to everyone and if it reached everywhere? So that's really what the heart of e-learning is about. And it was sort of something that was done in corporations, a little bit in schools, until, poof, we had a pandemic. And suddenly we literally had several billion people around the world, from 6-year-olds to 90-year-olds who were doing e-learning. And it's been quite a moment.
Indeed, I have my grandkids are not old enough yet to be in the e environment, but I know of parents and grandparents working with their kids with e-learning in kindergarten, and I go, oh gosh, But here's the thing: the kindergartners pick it up quicker than the grandparents.
Yeah. And it really is about using technology. Gosh, what we're doing right now is e-learning. I'm sitting here in my house in Saratoga Springs in upstate New York, and you're in Michigan, and we're coming together, and it's going out live, and it can go out afterwards. And that's what we imagined E. But to me, E is really about energizing. How do we energize learning and knowledge?
That is such That's such a positive energy. Looking at e-learning as energizing us, because that's where we need right now. And I think the concept of e-learning or virtual learning, whatever, has been pushed aside now because we're tired of it. Yeah. But so what are the big misconceptions of it? You've written about uncertainty and things like that. So what are you noticing, Elliott?
Well, let's just take a step back. I know a lot of the people who are engaged in this with you today are people from business and leadership. I want to go back in time, and some of you may be old enough to remember it, but when I grew up, we still had every now and then the mayor of New York would read the comic books on the radio. Now, it was fascinating, and it came from a time before that when maybe the printing presses weren't going or the like, but you could read the comic books. But I remember hearing two different mayors, and they shall remain nameless. And one, when he read the comics, the characters came alive. And the other one read the comics like this. It looks like it's cloudy outside.
Yeah.
I think so. Well, what we learned is that education is like anything that is storytelling. You've got to put energy into it. You've got to get it to reach people. And so I think where we got exhausted from a lot of what we do with e-learning, or even Zoom and WebEx and team meetings, when we left the energy out of it. You and I have both taught. A whiteboard isn't dull and it isn't exciting, but you could draw something on that whiteboard that totally wakes people up. Or you could do what my economics professor in my freshman year did, and draw a diagram that ought to be regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, because we all fell asleep by this diagram. And that's what we have to do. Technology is a multiplier of our energy, or it's a multiplier of our blahness.
Interesting. Early days of the pandemic, I talked to some of our colleagues who were speaking, and the big thing came, some of the positive of being virtual, other than not having to travel, was they felt a sense of what you're talking about, engagement. They could be it the chat, be it the breakout, whatever, all these things you can do live, but you could zero in on things and get people to respond. Have you explored that, Elliott?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And think for a moment, I'll impress you that I've got a camera control that I can do this.
Ooh,
I can
wow.
back all the way out, or I can also back all the way in. Now what's really interesting is, what I found is that what's cool about some of the e-learning is we're close enough that you can see my eyes. You can see the energy in my eyes. You can see the gestalt of me, and we have another friend in our coaches community from Tokyo, Teiko, and she is with Sony. And it's fascinating when we talk about when we use technology to connect with people, to communicate with people, to collaborate with people. And that's, to me, the sweet spot in all of that. But we were better at wiring people than we were at figuring out how to fully engage them in the E side of things, John.
Now, you touched on technology, and there's some new exciting things happening despite our pandemic and our third year, I think, of CES. So what the Consumer Electronics Show, which is the big extravaganza in Las Vegas. So you've been writing about this, observing it. What are you seeing, Elliott?
Well, every year, it's usually what I do the beginning of January. I go out there and I remember going there the last time, and it was about 160,000 people and 10,000 exhibitors, and whoa, it's way smaller. I was half thinking they would cancel it, but they did it in a hybrid way, but I'm following it from here. Here are three things that I'm finding that are of really high interest right now. The number one is health. What we're seeing right now is, maybe because we've gone through 2 years when people have had to take care of themselves, get home tests for COVID, do telehealth, which has happened. There's a lot of interest in what's the role of technology in being able to help you maintain your health. I saw one thing where literally you breathe into it and it measures the ketones, which are an indicator of fat metabolism in your system. I saw another one which made me really intrigued. If you had a grandparent who was older and living by themselves, right now they could have that little thing that they press when they fall down, but by that point it's kind of too late, But this was an environment modeling. So you literally could, as their caregiver, know, not taking their picture, but were they in the shower? Had they moved around? It measures the gestalt of their safety. And then we all know, and many people have during the pandemic increased their use of exercise machines at home. And we've got one upstairs that my wife Kathy has used, which is a mirror, where she literally has an opportunity to exercise with a coach who's far away with 2,000 people in the class.
Yeah.
That's been the health is one of the really big things that's happening there. The other thing that's happening, and I think we have to figure out where we're going to be with that, is robots. I'm a geek, I'm a techie, and if you walk around,
wait a minute, robot. I mean, are they going to take jobs from us stand-up speakers?
Probably there will. In fact, the John Baldoni number 9 is coming off this. Well, but you know what they will do, which is really interesting, is they'll help us think about some of the tasks that we might occasionally want to have automated. Now, the one that's been around for a while, and I don't know if it works well, but there's a vacuum that kind of goes around and automatically.
Oh, yeah, Roomba. My daughter has one of those. Yeah.
And I don't know if it works, but it's kind of cool.
Yeah.
But there are some other ones that are really sort of interesting of looking at. Could you have a tractor in a field in a farm that would operate? I wish we had a snowblower here in Saratoga that robotically cleaned our driveway for us. I think we're going to look at ones that are educational. I saw one this morning right before I logged on with you, John, which looks at giving medical students not a robot that's like, not like a rubber, person to operate on, but actually operate on a robot who is responding to what they're doing in that.
Right.
So whether you're teaching a dentist to do extractions, and the third area that I think we are going to see a lot of, and I'm really intrigued as a learning person, is curation technology. And what I mean by curation is, how do you figure out what to watch, what to listen to, what to read? I mean, my fantasy, John, I want a third button on my mouse called later. Because very often I get something from one of our colleagues and I'd love it, but Lainey, I'm not going to read it now. I want to click the later button and get back to it later. So we're going to see a lot of that. And the final piece that I was very, very intrigued with were how our screens are going to expand. Be prepared for literally a wall of your home, if you want it, to become a screen or a projection device. Because what we found is that if we're going to do a lot of digital connection, and I think not because of COVID, but we've sort of gone into that world where we will do more of that, dealing with an Elliott that's this big is different if we can deal with an Elliott that's almost real size. And there's a lot of empathy elements that relate to the size of the person you're dealing with. And so we're going to see expansion of TVs and the like along the way.
That's amazing. The problem with me is I'm one of those kind of persons. And when we used to go into sports bars, I don't know if you remember them, there were bars you could go into and there were multiple screens. I'm one of those instantly distracted people. I don't care if it's a hockey game of which I don't care about the particular teams. I'll find myself going to it. So,
but let me show you where we're heading, which is interesting. And some of the people watching this may love it or hate it. Imagine if there were a sport event, whatever it is, football, baseball, tennis, volleyball, and you could watch that with 12 friends or colleagues watching the same game in their home, and they're all around the screen, okay? And when you're cheering, you could all hear each other's cheering. If you wanted to, you could click in, let's say, a football game. you could click on your favorite quarterback or your favorite runner, and there would be an isolating picture that would just go to that. So what we're going to get to is personalization. How do we personalize and or collaborate with other people using technology?
Great. Well, speaking of personalization, it dovetails into my last question about the e-learning environment. We've been experimenting or utilizing e-learning for a long, long time. We're in a virtual world now, but we're going back eventually. So do you think all from an educational, corporate education part, we're going to move to a hybrid model, which is part virtual and part live? What do you think, Elliott?
Yeah, no, I think we will. But you know what? But before we see it as earth shaking, okay, I would argue, think about your relatives, okay? You've got a hybrid relationship with your relatives. You've got some relatives that you may talk on the phone pretty regularly. You have some relatives that you send a birthday card to once a year. You have some relatives that you want to meet with and have dinner with a lot, or maybe just on Thanksgiving. And what we've learned to do in that world is we've picked the format that fits our needs, our requirements, the format of how we want to be, and we blend those. And so I think what's going to happen with learning and knowledge is we're going to continually be blending. But what's different, and I think it's critical what's different. Number one, we're going to be hyper portable. So this little device you have that used to be a phone, but most people don't make a lot of phone calls on it anymore, becomes my curiosity engine, so I can look something up. I can say, oh, what did John say about grace? And I can get that. It becomes a way in which I can get not classes, because classes can be helpful, but sometimes I don't want a class. Sometimes I want to get a 3-minute piece of video that shows what somebody is thinking about in that sense, and so what we're going to start to see is also the ability to get knowledge that's real time from somebody that we can in real time talk to, but we can also go way back into history. I want to hear what Peter Senge said about the learning dimension in 1991, and
that's great.
So I'm excited about we use hybrid. I don't know if I love that word, but I use the word blend it more. How do we blend these different flavors together? Kind of like putting Lego blocks together. And I think that's what's going to be true for all learning.
Great. Now I want to move into, because you're in the E world, and I love the way you and viewers have commented on the E as in energy. There's another E that I'm going to apply to Elliott, which is experimenter. And did that sense of it, experimentation, lead you to Broadway? How did that come apart?
I've been an experimenter my whole life. I would share, there goes one of the fire trucks nearby going by. It's very interesting. This is the way my brain works. We actually use sirens the wrong way. We use sirens to hear it coming from a long way away. Mm-hmm. And after a while, particularly in some environments, you don't hear it. Whereas in some parts of the world, they put that siren on as they're approaching a car or as they're approaching, an intersection. But for me, one of the pieces of my background is I grew up with a major speech defect. My doctor would go in my mouth, and I've got an elevated palate. I guess if it were 2 micrometers higher, I would have what we call a cleft palate. So around age 4 or 5, if you and I were talking, I would say to you, the little yellow. I literally was understood by about 4 people. They happened to be in my family. So I had to experiment as I grew up, as I took speech therapy, with how to communicate. And I realized you got to use your hands. Sometimes you got to draw. Sometimes it's just nodding. Yeah. And I think I became a geek, a nerd, and an experimenter. I had a ham radio. I had a Morse code thing. But here's the key to experimentation. I think it's an important one. You don't do invention without failure on your way to success. You don't
Sure.
do invention without failure on your way to success. So I grew up knowing that you could always experiment, and part of it meant you would fail, and that would tell you, well, that's how I have to change the way in which I look at something. So that's been part. Now, how did I become a Broadway person? I was a keynote speaker like you. I was the organizer of big conferences. And I realized that I never used this word before. I was a producer. A producer. I produced experiences that had high impact on people by creating or delivering or facilitating storytelling. And then I went to the theater with my wife, and I sat there and I said, you know what? We know how to do this. We just don't know how to do it in the theater world. And it led to a small micro involvement. And now we've had over 29 Broadway shows that we've been producers of. Sometimes it's a little bit, and sometimes we've been pretty senior producers. You won't get rich on Broadway, I guarantee you. And right now it's been tough because a lot of our Broadway stars have been without work during COVID. But I love the idea of storytelling and performance and music.
And that leads to really why your Broadway experience, and it brings us into the virtual or engagement world. And you have created, as I alluded to earlier, the empathy concerts. What led you to that, and what is an empathy concert?
Well, once the pandemic hit, and you and I were part of some wonderful early morning conversations, literally every day, that our friends, including Marshall Goldsmith and Scott and others, did to bring together business authors like us, CEOs from around the world. It was our method of support and survival. And what I realized very early on was, what could I contribute during the pandemic? And we didn't know how long it would be. I thought it would be a few weeks, and it's turned out to be 2 years. And I realized that focusing on empathy was something that would be there. And we defined empathy in a really interesting way. It's not about sympathy. It's not about coaching. It's not about therapy. It's really about connecting with other individuals in a safe conversation about what they're feeling or what they're experiencing, without having to be their problem solvers in that. And then we said, well, what would be great would be to combine business advisors and authors like ourselves with Broadway stars. And so I have a great friend. He's a brother from another mother, Telly Leong. He was Aladdin on Broadway for almost 2 years. And he and I have pulled together, we've done 40 of them now, 40 free 1-hour shows online with the leading names in Broadway, and with wonderful, wonderful authors and colleagues from every part of the world. And literally tens of thousands of people have watched them. And you can get all of them are now on my website, Masie.com, MASIE.com. And there's some really good tunes on there too. So.
They're fantastic. And the programs that I've seen, what you did is you provided an avenue, a venue for performers who needed to perform on stage or do perform, make a living on stage, that couldn't because of the pandemic. You provided them an outlet. And that was such I want to say a psychic relief for them, but it was they're sharing their talents with us. And sadly, well, I wouldn't say sadly it continues, but not because anything bad. Well, because our pandemic is dragging on. But it has been a moment in time where you've brought together the entertainment world and maybe some of the thought leadership world and blended it up. And a lot of people have found it of great value. And I know our colleagues salute you for that. So I wanted to give you a shout out. So it's very special.
Yeah. So. Thank you, John. And and I've seen, and not just because what we've done, but that word empathy has become a lot more the language of business. It's interesting. There's this big conversation about the number of people who are resigning or moving jobs and the like. And for the most part, people are not doing that to get a bigger wage. for the most part, people are leaving where they are because they want more engagement. They want to have an opportunity to learn more. And the word that comes up over and over again when you talk to CEOs about what do they need to do now is we need to increase empathy with the reality. Imagine being a flight attendant now, having not worked at all, and then coming back and finding yourself in the middle of difficult conversations about masks and not getting normal food. And so if you are the CEO or the manager of an airline, there are all sorts of good processes you need, all sorts of good leadership pieces. But I got to tell you, if you don't know how to build empathy with your employees, they'll never be in a situation to be empathetic with your customers. And so it's actually turned out to not just be an intervention for the pandemic, but I think it's a really important conversation that we need to have for generations to come.
Great. It's so true. And I want to turn the tables a little bit on you. You've done 40 empathy concerts and you've shared that, and you're such a giving person. What has it meant to you, or what have you learned from doing these concerts week after week? And what has it taught you, Elliott?
Well, a great question. I don't have an instant answer, so I'll give you a very primal. No, but the best answers, I think, when you interview somebody is when you get primal ones from them. A lot of leaders, a lot of our business colleagues, they know how they're wired. They know how to be. They have their wired self, their well thought through self. When you start to have a conversation about empathy, you realize that very often our wiring isn't perfect. And very often we have areas that are points of pain, point of confusion, point of, not even understanding our own reaction to stuff. So what I've come away from is realizing how much we need to not increase our moments of collaboration, but to be creating environments that allow almost any conversation to happen, and I worry, I think our nation has become in many ways divided around political, partisan, or other lines. And there are real divides in other ways, but how do you use empathy? And literally sometimes it is music. I can't play the opening song to Lion King without seeing the eyes and bodies of the people listening to it change for a bit. So I think it's combining the power of music, which for many of us became part of our DNA by going to church or synagogue or other religious institutions, with wonderful storytelling and with opening our hearts. And I think that's pretty darn potent.
That's pretty special. I think you've undercut my question, because I ask every guest a moment of grace in their lives, and I think you've given it us. Unless you have a further thought, is there a moment of grace that you want to share with us? I think your empathy concerts are significant in that, and the learning it have brought you. But is there anything else you want to add, Elliott?
Well, I'll share an interesting thing. In this process of the pandemic, I've reshaped our organization, and some of us are operating virtually. And literally 2 people who had worked for me over 17 to 20 years have moved on to other things. In the process of their leaving, it wasn't an emergency and it wasn't a crisis. I wrote each one about a 3 to 5 page letter reflecting all the things they had accomplished and what I have viewed in them, and reflecting back to them that they were very different than that person I hired 17 or 20 years ago. And I think that's part of grace. I think it is taking that moment of reflection to gracefully look at how we've grown and changed, and then communicate it. And it was important for me to communicate it in a written format, as an artifact that that person could look at 6 days, 6 months, or 6 years from now. So that's been one of the big pieces of grace for me, to reflect and to document the artifacts of the changes that have happened to us.
What a gift you gave them to talk about their transformation. Grace, as we know, is an act of transformation, and you have shown it in practical and tactical terms. So, Elliott, it has been a wonderful time to have you. How can people find you? So,
really simple, Masie, MASIE.com. I've got a newsletter. I've got video there, the empathy concerts there, and I'm sure we'll bump into each other in the great virtual world.
Great. Elliott, it's been a pleasure. And with that, I'm going to sign out. So.